Hello, my dear friends. Imagine the world just before sunrise, somewhere between Macedonia and the edge of the known earth. The air is cool, the camp is quiet, and thousands of men sleep on hard ground after another long march. At the center of this moving world is Alexander, not yet called the Great by history but already carrying the weight of an empire in motion. Before battles, before speeches, before decisions that will change continents, there is something very ordinary that shapes his days. Food, simple, practical, sometimes scarce, and always tied to movement and survival. Alexander's diet was not the feast-filled fantasy many imagine when they think of kings. For most of his life, he lived like a soldier, not like a palace ruler. He was raised with discipline, taught to endure hardship, and encouraged to live close to his men. This philosophy extended directly to what he ate. Meals were not about pleasure. They were about strength, endurance, and clarity of mind. In his early life in Macedonia, Alexander grew up eating the foods common to his homeland. Bread made from barley or wheat formed the base of most meals. It was dense, filling, and easy to carry. This bread was often coarse, far from soft or refined, but it provided steady energy. Alongside it came olives, a staple of the Greek world. Olives offered fat, salt, and durability, surviving long journeys without spoiling. Meat was present but not daily. When it appeared, it was usually goat, sheep, or occasionally pork. Beef was rare. Meat was roasted simply over open fires, seasoned lightly, if at all. Alexander was known to avoid excess, believing heavy eating weakened the body and the mind. This belief was reinforced by his teacher Aristotle, who emphasized moderation and balance rather than indulgence. Wine was part of Alexander's life from a young age, but it was rarely consumed straight. Like most Greeks, he drank wine mixed with water. Drinking unmixed wine was seen as uncivilized. Wine served several purposes. It provided calories, helped preserve water, and created social bonds among soldiers. Still, Alexander often drank less than those around him, especially during campaigns, preferring alertness over comfort. As his conquests began, Alexander's diet changed not in luxury but in variety. Each new region brought unfamiliar foods. In Asia Minor, his army encountered new fruits, grains, and methods of preparation. Alexander encouraged sampling local food, not as indulgence but as adaptation. Understanding what the land offered was part of understanding how to rule it. During long marches, meals were often extremely simple. Bread, dried meat, cheese, and water formed the core of daily rations. Cheese, especially hard varieties, was valued for its durability and nutrition. It traveled well and required no preparation. These foods were eaten quickly, often standing, sometimes while moving. Eating was not a pause in the day. It was a brief refueling before the next demand. Alexander was known to share these meals with his men. He did not isolate himself behind lavish tables while soldiers starved. Ancient sources describe him eating in public, sitting on the ground, accepting the same portions. This was not just humility, it was strategy. Sharing hardship built loyalty, and loyalty held the army together as it moved farther from home than any Greek force had gone before. As the campaign pushed deeper into Persia, food became more abundant in some regions and more scarce in others. Persian lands offered richer agriculture. Here, Alexander encountered finer bread, fruits like dates and figs, and more spices than he had known before. He allowed these foods into his diet, but he remained cautious. Too much richness was seen as a threat to discipline. Banquets did occur, especially after victories. These events included roasted meats, abundant bread, wine, and local delicacies. Yet even in these moments, Alexander was careful. He valued conversation, storytelling, and unity more than overeating. Sources often note that while others drank heavily, Alexander remained focused, sometimes leaving early to rest or plan. On campaign, hunger was common. There were times when supplies failed, when land could not provide enough, when soldiers survived on minimal rations for days. Alexander endured these periods without complaint, eating little more than what his men had. In extreme cases, he famously refused water offered only to him, pouring it onto the ground so no soldier would feel abandoned. Food, or the lack of it, became a shared experience. As Alexander moved east toward India, his diet expanded again. New grains, unfamiliar vegetables, and spiced dishes entered his world. He was curious but cautious. He tasted, observed how his body reacted, and adjusted. He believed the body of a commander had to remain steady, not distracted by excess or discomfort. Despite the growing wealth of his empire, Alexander never fully embraced luxury in eating. His meals remained functional. Even late in life, when surrounded by riches, he preferred simple foods eaten among companions. The table was a place of strategy, discussion, and bonding, not indulgence. Food for Alexander was fuel, discipline, and symbolism. What he ate reflected how he ruled. Simple bread and shared meals reminded his army that their king marched with them, suffered with them, and survived the same conditions. This approach helped carry him across deserts, mountains, and rivers, shaping one of the most extraordinary campaigns in human history. And as this first part settles quietly, the story of Alexander's food is only beginning, because as his empire grew, so did the challenges of feeding an army across the ancient world. And those challenges would shape not only what Alexander ate, but how his entire campaign survived. As Alexander's army moved farther from Macedonia, food stopped being something familiar and became something strategic. Feeding a king was simple. Feeding tens of thousands of soldiers across unknown lands was one of the greatest challenges of the ancient world. Alexander understood this early, and his own eating habits reflected that understanding. He ate not as a man separated from the problem, but as part of it. On campaign, Alexander's daily meals followed the rhythm of marching. There was rarely a fixed breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Instead, food appeared when it could. Often this meant eating early in the morning before the army moved, or late at night after a long day of marching or fighting. These meals were quiet, practical, and brief. Bread remained the foundation. Flatbreads or dense loaves were carried by soldiers themselves, sometimes baked days earlier. Hard bread could last longer and be softened with water or wine if needed. Dried foods became essential. Dried meat, often goat or sheep, was cut thin and salted heavily. This preserved it during long journeys and harsh weather. The taste was strong, sometimes unpleasant, but it provided protein and strength. Alexander ate this same food. Ancient writers emphasize that he did not demand better portions when supplies were low. His presence during these meals reinforced the idea that hardship was shared. Cheese continued to be a major part of his diet. Hard cheeses made from sheep or goat milk were ideal for travel. They resisted spoilage and required no cooking. Combined with bread and olives, they formed a complete portable meal. This combination appears again and again in descriptions of Greek military life, and Alexander followed this tradition closely. Water was often scarce. Rivers could not always be trusted, and wells were not guaranteed. Wine mixed with water helped reduce risk and provided energy. Alexander drank carefully, especially before battles. He believed a clear mind mattered more than comfort. When wine was scarce, he accepted the same watered portions as his soldiers. When it was abundant, he still avoided excess during active campaigns. As the army entered Persian territory, food supplies sometimes improved dramatically. The Persians had developed advanced agriculture, irrigation, and food storage. Alexander's forces encountered grain stores, fruit orchards, and livestock on a scale far beyond Greece. Bread became softer and more refined. Rice and barley appeared more frequently. Fruits such as dates, pomegranates, and figs became common additions to meals. Alexander tasted these foods, but he did not immediately adopt Persian luxury. He believed that sudden changes weakened discipline. Instead, he allowed variety while maintaining moderation. Meals might include more fruits or better bread, but portions remained controlled. He wanted his body and his army to remain used to movement, not comfort. Meat during this phase became more available. Lamb, goat, and sometimes beef appeared more often, especially after victories when captured supplies were distributed. Meat was usually roasted simply. Heavy sauces or rich preparations were rare during active campaigning. Alexander avoided food that made the body feel slow or heavy. Banquets became more frequent after major victories. These were not daily events, but symbolic ones. Food served at these banquets reflected the region conquered. Persian-style dishes, spices, and wine appeared. Alexander used these meals to reward loyalty, strengthen bonds among officers, and display respect for local customs. Even here, he often ate less than others, focusing more on conversation and planning. One important detail noted by ancient sources is Alexander's attitude toward hunger. He believed hunger sharpened focus. While he did not starve himself deliberately, he accepted hunger as part of leadership. There were times when food ran dangerously low, especially during desert crossings. During these moments, Alexander reduced his own intake rather than increasing it, believing a commander should never be seen eating well while soldiers struggled. As the campaign stretched on for years, fatigue and injury affected Alexander's body. His diet adapted again, not toward luxury but toward recovery. Broths made from meat and bones became important when solid food was difficult to eat. Warm liquids helped restore strength after illness or wounds. These simple broths were common in ancient armies and valued for their restorative effect. Spices entered his diet more noticeably in eastern regions, not heavily but enough to change flavor and digestion. Spices also helped preserve food and improve morale. A meal that tasted different could lift spirits during long campaigns. Alexander allowed this, understanding that morale was as important as nutrition. Despite access to immense wealth, Alexander never turned his meals into displays of excess during active campaigns. Gold and silver mattered less than grain and water. He understood that an empire could not be eaten. Only what could be carried, cooked, and shared mattered in the end. Food also became a political tool. Sharing local food with local leaders signaled respect. Accepting foreign dishes showed openness. Alexander used meals to communicate without words. What he ate, and with whom he ate it, sent messages throughout the empire. As his army moved closer to India, conditions changed again. Climate, crops, and water sources were unfamiliar. New grains appeared. Vegetables previously unknown to Greeks entered their meals. Alexander observed carefully, allowing adaptation while avoiding extremes. He believed the body of a commander should remain stable even when the world around it changed. Through all of this, Alexander's eating remained simple in principle. Eat enough to endure. Eat what the land provides. Share food with soldiers. Avoid excess that dulls the mind. These habits supported not only his health but the unity of his army. And as this part continues quietly, the question of what Alexander ate becomes inseparable from how he conquered. Because food was not just nourishment, it was discipline, morale, strategy, and survival, carried forward with every step of his long march across the ancient world. As the campaign pushed deeper into Asia, food became less about tradition and more about adaptation. Alexander was no longer moving through lands connected to Greek culture. He was now operating in environments that challenged everything he had learned about eating, storage, and survival. Climate, terrain, and unfamiliar crops forced constant adjustment, and Alexander's diet changed alongside the changing world around him. In regions where agriculture was less predictable, foraging became essential. Soldiers gathered wild plants, grains, and fruits when supply lines stretched too thin. Alexander allowed this, but under control. Random foraging could poison men or weaken discipline. Knowledgeable locals were often forced or persuaded to guide the army towards safe foods. Alexander himself ate these gathered foods when necessary, reinforcing trust and reducing fear among the troops. When the king survived a meal, soldiers followed. Grain remained the backbone of sustenance. In many eastern regions, barley gave way to other grains, some ground into flour, others boiled into thick porridges. These porridges were filling, easy to digest, and required little fuel to prepare. Alexander accepted these meals without complaint. They lacked refinement, but they sustained energy during relentless marches. Vegetables played a larger role than in Macedonia. Lentils, beans, onions, and garlic appeared frequently. These foods were cheap, abundant, and nourishing. Garlic and onions were especially valued, not just for flavor, but for their believed medicinal qualities. Ancient soldiers believed these foods strengthened the body and protected against illness. Alexander shared these beliefs, allowing such foods to become common in camp meals. In arid regions, meat became rarer. Livestock could not always be carried long distances without loss. When animals were slaughtered, nothing was wasted. Meat, fat, marrow, and organs were consumed. Bones were boiled repeatedly to extract every possible nutrient. Alexander ate these same preparations, understanding that waste weakened survival. Luxury had no place where endurance was required. Salt became increasingly important. It preserved food, improved taste, and replaced minerals lost through sweat. Control of salt sources mattered almost as much as control of water. When salt was scarce, meals became harder to endure. Alexander did not hoard it for himself. Equal distribution prevented resentment and maintained morale. Water scarcity shaped eating habits dramatically. In desert regions, solid food was sometimes avoided during the hottest hours, as digestion increased thirst. Alexander adjusted meal timing accordingly, eating when water was available and resting when it was not. This rhythm protected the army from exhaustion and collapse. As the army moved through fertile regions again, food abundance returned, but Alexander remained cautious. He had seen how sudden excess weakened soldiers. He limited indulgence even when supplies allowed more. This restraint kept the army lean, alert, and capable of sudden movement. In the Persian heartlands, Alexander encountered organized food storage on a massive scale. Granaries, dried fruit stores, and preserved meats allowed more reliable meals. Here, his diet included more variety, but still avoided daily luxury. Bread improved in quality. Fruits became more frequent. Meat appeared regularly but not excessively. Banquets during this phase took on political importance. Alexander used shared meals to display respect for Persian customs. He ate local dishes alongside Persian nobles, signaling inclusion rather than domination. These meals were carefully balanced. He participated but never lost control. Eating became diplomacy. One notable shift was the increased use of spices. Spices improved flavor, preserved food, and aided digestion. Alexander did not reject them, but he avoided overwhelming richness. The goal remained clarity of mind and physical readiness. Meals were meant to support leadership, not distract from it. As wounds and illness accumulated over years of campaigning, Alexander's diet adapted again. Heavy foods were avoided during recovery. Light meals, broths, and softened bread became common. These were easier to digest and allowed faster return to activity. Ancient medicine placed great importance on diet during healing, and Alexander followed this practice closely. Food also became a psychological tool. After long periods of hardship, a simple improved meal could restore morale. Alexander understood this deeply. He allowed better rations strategically, not constantly. Soldiers learned to associate success and survival with improved food, reinforcing loyalty and endurance. During river crossings and naval movements, diets shifted once more. Fish entered meals when available. Fresh fish provided protein without requiring long storage. Alexander ate fish when campaigning near rivers and coasts, adapting again to what the environment offered. Despite these changes, one pattern remained constant. Alexander avoided isolation in eating. He did not separate himself behind private feasts while others struggled. His presence at shared meals reinforced unity. Food became a visible symbol of leadership. As the army continued eastward, the accumulated strain of years on campaign made every meal matter more. Bodies aged quickly under constant pressure. Injuries healed slowly. Alexander's diet increasingly focused on maintaining strength rather than building it. He accepted that endurance, not growth, was the goal. Through deserts, mountains, and fertile valleys, Alexander's eating habits reflected a core philosophy: eat what the land provides, share hardship, avoid excess, maintain clarity. This philosophy helped carry him farther than any Greek before him, not through luxury, but through discipline. And as the march continued onward, food remained both a necessity and a message. Every loaf broken, every shared ration, every refusal of special treatment reminded the army that their leader lived within the same limits as they did. This shared endurance fed loyalty more effectively than gold ever could. As the campaign entered its longest and most exhausting phase, food became less about variety and more about reliability. Alexander was now leading an army that had been marching, fighting, and adapting for years. Bodies were worn. Supplies were strained. Morale depended on predictability. In this stage, Alexander's eating habits reflected a deep understanding that survival depended on routine more than novelty. The army began to rely heavily on standardized rations whenever possible. Grain was measured carefully. Portions were calculated to last across distances where resupply was uncertain. Alexander accepted these limits without protest. Ancient writers describe him eating measured portions even when more was available, believing that regularity strengthened both body and discipline. Eating too much one day created weakness the next. Cooking methods remained simple. Roasting, boiling, and baking over open fires dominated camp life. Complex preparation required time, fuel, and attention the army could not spare. Alexander favored foods that could be cooked quickly and eaten without ceremony. Meals often took place in silence, surrounded by the sounds of armor being repaired, animals being tended, and scouts preparing for movement. During mountain crossings, diets grew harsher. Cold, limited cooking options. Fuel was scarce. In these conditions, soldiers survived on dry bread, cheese, and whatever preserved meat remained. Alexander shared these meals without complaint. His willingness to endure cold and hunger alongside his men reinforced authority more effectively than speeches ever could. In high-altitude regions, digestion became difficult. Heavy foods caused discomfort and weakness. Alexander adapted again, favoring lighter meals when possible. Thin broths, softened bread, and warm drinks helped maintain strength without exhausting the body. Ancient medical thought supported this approach, emphasizing balance between environment and diet. As the army moved through regions with developed trade networks, Alexander encountered preserved foods unfamiliar to Greeks. Pickled vegetables, fermented grains, and dried fruits appeared more often. These foods lasted longer and provided nutrients during extended marches. Alexander accepted them readily, valuing function over tradition. Fruit continued to play an important role whenever available. Dates, figs, and apples provided quick energy and lifted morale. These foods required no cooking and could be eaten during short pauses. Alexander understood the psychological value of sweetness after long hardship. A small comfort could restore focus when bodies were near exhaustion. Fish became more common when rivers and coasts allowed. Fresh fish offered protein without the logistical burden of livestock. Soldiers learned to catch, clean, and cook fish quickly. Alexander participated in these meals, reinforcing adaptability and encouraging the army to use every available resource. One consistent feature of Alexander's diet during this phase was restraint during success. After victories, when supplies were captured and celebrations possible, he avoided overeating. He allowed controlled feasting to reward soldiers, but he himself remained moderate. He believed victory required clarity, not indulgence. Excess after success often led to mistakes. Alcohol consumption remained carefully managed. Wine was still mixed with water, and Alexander often reduced his intake during critical periods. Ancient sources note that when discipline began to slip due to drink, Alexander intervened, sometimes limiting access temporarily. He understood that food and drink shaped behavior as much as weapons did. As years passed, Alexander's body showed signs of strain. Old wounds flared. Illness became more frequent. His diet shifted again, focusing more on recovery and maintenance. Warm broths, softer foods, and rest periods became necessary. He accepted these changes not as weakness but as adaptation. Leadership required knowing when to conserve strength. Food distribution became increasingly symbolic. Alexander made sure that rations were shared visibly and fairly. Favoritism in food could fracture loyalty faster than any battlefield defeat. By eating publicly and accepting the same portions, he reinforced unity, even when conditions were harsh. In regions far from any familiar agriculture, experimentation increased. Local guides introduced unfamiliar plants and grains. Alexander approached these foods cautiously, often testing small amounts before allowing wider use. His own willingness to taste first reduced fear and prevented panic. Trust in food became trust in leadership. The army's cooks, once simple servants, became critical figures. Their ability to transform limited supplies into edible meals determined survival. Alexander respected their role, understanding that nourishment was as vital as strategy. A fed army marched farther. A hungry one broke. As the campaign stretched on, Alexander's meals became quieter, shorter, and more functional. Conversation focused on logistics rather than pleasure. Food served as preparation, not reward. This shift reflected the reality of endless movement and growing resistance among troops. Through all of this, one principle remained unchanged. Alexander refused to separate his diet from his army's experience. He did not retreat into private kitchens or demand special ingredients. His body bore the same strain. His hunger matched theirs. This shared endurance became one of the strongest forces holding the army together. Food at this stage was no longer just sustenance, it was discipline. It was morale. It was leadership made visible through restraint. Every meal reinforced the idea that survival depended on unity, adaptation, and acceptance of limits. And as the long road continued onward, Alexander's eating habits continued to evolve with the land, the climate, and the condition of his men, carrying forward a philosophy that valued endurance over indulgence and clarity over comfort. By this stage of the campaign, food had become inseparable from exhaustion. Years of marching had reshaped bodies, habits, and expectations. Alexander was no longer feeding an army of young men full of anticipation. He was sustaining veterans whose strength depended entirely on careful management of energy. What Alexander ate now mattered not just for survival, but for preventing collapse. Daily meals became more predictable, and predictability itself became a form of stability. Grain rations were the backbone. Whether baked into bread, boiled into porridge, or eaten dry when fuel was scarce, grain provided slow, steady energy. Alexander accepted these repetitive meals without complaint. He understood that consistency prevented shock to the body and reduced illness. Sudden changes in diet could weaken men already pushed to their limits. Cooking was often minimal. Fires were kept small to conserve fuel and avoid detection. Boiled meals became more common than roasted ones. A single pot might serve dozens of men. Grain, water, salt, and whatever vegetables or scraps of meat were available were combined into thick stews. These stews were not pleasant, but they were efficient. Alexander ate them alongside officers and common soldiers alike. In regions where animals could not survive the journey, meat became rare. Fat was valued more than muscle. Animal fat added calories quickly and helped men endure cold and fatigue. When animals were slaughtered, marrow was prized. Bones were cracked and boiled repeatedly. Alexander did not reject these foods. He understood that in extreme conditions, nourishment mattered more than taste. As the army moved through unfamiliar climates, digestion became a serious concern. Hot regions drained strength quickly. Heavy foods caused nausea and weakness. Alexander adjusted meal timing carefully. Large meals were avoided during peak heat. Eating shifted to cooler hours, early morning and late evening. This reduced strain on the body and preserved water. Water scarcity shaped everything. In some regions, food intake was reduced deliberately to conserve water. Alexander followed these restrictions himself. Ancient sources describe moments when water was brought to him alone, and he refused to drink, pouring it out so no soldier would feel abandoned. Food and drink were tied together in leadership. Unequal consumption could destroy morale instantly. As the army approached India, the agricultural landscape changed again. Rice became more common than barley or wheat. Alexander allowed its use gradually. Rice was filling, easy to digest, and required less fuel to cook. It suited long marches and heavy labor. Alexander ate it as part of his daily meals, adapting once more to the land rather than forcing Macedonian habits onto it. Vegetables and legumes remained essential. Lentils, beans, onions, and garlic continued to appear regularly. These foods were cheap, reliable, and believed to strengthen the body. Garlic in particular was associated with endurance and protection against illness. Alexander encouraged its use, trusting both tradition and experience. Fruit remained a morale booster. In harsh conditions, even a small amount of fruit lifted spirits. Dates and figs were especially valuable because they provided quick energy and stored well. Alexander allowed fruit to be distributed strategically, often after difficult marches or battles. These moments of sweetness carried psychological weight far beyond their nutritional value. Alcohol consumption during this phase was tightly controlled. Wine was diluted heavily or limited altogether during critical operations. Alexander believed intoxication weakened judgment and discipline. While he did drink on occasion, especially during controlled celebrations, he avoided it during sustained campaigns. He valued clarity over comfort. Illness became more frequent as years passed. Fevers, infections, and lingering wounds weakened even strong men. Alexander's own health suffered. During illness, his diet shifted again. Solid foods were reduced. Broths, warm drinks, and softened bread became common. Ancient medicine emphasized diet as treatment, and Alexander followed this approach carefully. Food shortages tested leadership more than battles. When supplies ran dangerously low, Alexander reduced his own intake visibly. This was not symbolic alone. It preserved trust. Soldiers could endure hunger if they believed it was shared. Food equality became one of the strongest forces keeping the army intact. At times, food was acquired through negotiation rather than force. Alexander understood that a starving army was vulnerable. He used diplomacy to secure grain and livestock when possible, reducing the need for destructive foraging. When force was necessary, distribution was carefully managed to prevent chaos and waste. The longer the campaign continued, the more food became a measure of control rather than pleasure. Meals were shorter. Conversation was limited. Eating became preparation for the next demand. Alexander accepted this shift fully. His own eating habits mirrored the army's state. Functional, focused, enduring. Even during moments of relative abundance, Alexander resisted long-term luxury. He feared that comfort would weaken resolve. Instead, He allowed brief relief followed by return to discipline. This rhythm preserved strength while preventing complacency. Food also became part of Alexander's identity as a leader. He was known not for what he ate, but for how he ate. Simply, publicly, without privilege. These habits shaped how soldiers viewed him, not as a distant king, but as a commander who shared their limits. By this point, Alexander's diet was no longer tied to any single culture. It was a reflection of movement itself. Whatever sustained life, whatever the land allowed, whatever preserved strength without dulling the mind. This adaptability became one of his greatest advantages. And as the march pressed onward, food continued to shape every decision, every pause, and every step forward, quietly determining how far Alexander and his army could still go. As the campaign moved into its final, most punishing years, food became a quiet negotiation between survival and decline. Alexander was no longer simply leading men forward. He was holding together a force stretched thin by distance, climate, and time. In this phase, what he ate reflected not ambition, but endurance under strain. The army's diet narrowed further. Variety became rare and reliability became everything. Grain rations were guarded closely. Spoilage, theft, or miscalculation could cripple momentum. Alexander accepted stricter rationing without complaint, even when illness or fatigue might have justified extra portions. Ancient sources emphasize that he refused special treatment, believing leadership dissolved the moment food inequality appeared. Cooking methods simplified even more. Fires were kept low and brief. Boiling dominated because it extracted the most nourishment from the least material. Grain was boiled until soft. Bones were boiled repeatedly. Vegetables were added when available, not for pleasure, but to stretch volume and improve digestion. Alexander ate these same meals, often quickly, sometimes distracted by reports or plans, but never absent from the shared experience. In tropical regions, heat altered everything. Appetite dropped naturally. Heavy foods caused weakness. Alexander adjusted again, favoring lighter meals and spreading intake across the day. Small amounts eaten more frequently preserved strength without overwhelming the body. This approach reduced exhaustion and prevented collapse during long marches. Water scarcity continued to shape diet. When water was limited, food intake was reduced intentionally. Digestion required water, and thirst was more dangerous than hunger. Alexander followed this logic personally. Ancient writers record moments when his restraint steadied panic among troops. Food discipline became emotional discipline. As the army pushed deeper into unfamiliar lands, experimentation continued cautiously. Local grains, roots, and plants were introduced under supervision. Alexander often tasted first. This practice served two purposes. It reduced fear of poisoning, and it reinforced trust. Soldiers followed the king's example more readily than orders. Rice became increasingly central where it was available. It cooked quickly, digested easily, and provided steady energy. Alexander accepted rice not as a novelty, but as a solution. He allowed it to replace traditional grains where conditions demanded. This flexibility kept the army moving when rigid tradition would have failed. Fruit availability fluctuated sharply. In fertile zones, fruit briefly returned as a morale lifter. In harsh zones, it disappeared completely. Alexander managed these shifts carefully. He did not allow sudden indulgence after deprivation. Portions were controlled to avoid digestive illness and emotional swings. Stability mattered more than pleasure. Meat was consumed when possible, but increasingly as a supplement rather than a centerpiece. Livestock losses mounted with distance and climate. When animals were slaughtered, distribution was strict. No hoarding, no favoritism. Fat and marrow were prioritized for those most weakened. Alexander monitored this process closely, understanding that food distribution could fracture loyalty faster than defeat. Alcohol use remained limited. Wine was still mixed heavily with water, and sometimes removed entirely during critical phases. Alexander believed intoxication under such conditions was dangerous. When officers complained, he reminded them that clarity was survival. He himself reduced consumption further as illness and injury accumulated. As wounds healed more slowly and fevers became frequent, Alexander's diet shifted toward maintenance rather than strength. Broths, warm liquids, and softened grain dominated. These foods were easier to digest and allowed continued movement. Ancient medicine emphasized the role of diet in balancing bodily humors, and Alexander followed these principles carefully. Psychological fatigue became as serious as physical hunger. Alexander used food strategically to counter despair. After especially brutal marches, a slightly improved ration could restore will. A warm meal after cold nights could stabilize morale. These decisions were timed precisely. Too frequent and they lost effect. Too rare and men broke. Food logistics became increasingly complex. Supply lines stretched impossibly long. Alexander relied more on local procurement, negotiation, and adaptation. He understood that conquest without nourishment was illusion. Victories meant nothing if men could not eat afterward. As resistance grew among troops nearing the end of the campaign, food became a symbol of trust. Soldiers watched Alexander's plate closely. If he ate little, they endured. If he refused privilege, they followed. His restraint became a language stronger than command. Even when the army reached regions of abundance, Alexander resisted long rest and heavy feasting. He feared stagnation more than hunger. Comfort weakened urgency. His diet remained controlled, reflecting his belief that momentum was life. By this stage, Alexander's eating habits were no longer about conquest. They were about holding together something already strained to its limit. Every meal was measured not against desire, but against necessity. Food had become rhythm. Eat, move, endure, adapt, repeat. Alexander's body bore the marks of this rhythm, and so did his army. Their survival depended not on abundance, but on discipline refined through years of shared hardship. And as the march continued forward, food remained the quiet force shaping each day, determining not just how far Alexander could go, but how long his army could remain an army at all. As the campaign dragged on, food stopped being something discussed aloud. It became an unspoken constant, shaping every decision without needing to be named. Alexander understood now, more clearly than ever, that hunger did not simply weaken bodies. It altered judgment, patience, and loyalty. In this phase of his life, what he ate, and what he refused to eat, was as much leadership as strategy. Daily rations grew tighter in many regions. Grain was weighed with care. Any loss through spoilage or mismanagement could slow the army to a halt. Alexander insisted on strict oversight, not from comfort, but from necessity. He ate the same measured portions as his men, sometimes smaller, especially during periods of uncertainty. This restraint was visible, and visibility mattered. Soldiers watched closely. Leadership, in these moments, was demonstrated at the mess fire, not on horseback. Meals were increasingly eaten without pause. Soldiers chewed while standing. Alexander did the same. There was no separation between eating and moving, between nourishment and labor. Food was no longer a break from hardship. It was part of it. This rhythm reduced expectation. When men stopped expecting comfort, they conserved strength. In regions where grain failed or ran out, improvisation intensified. Soldiers ground wild seeds, mixed them with water, and cooked rough cakes over embers. These cakes were dense, bitter, and difficult to swallow. Alexander ate them without comment. Ancient sources describe his willingness to accept such food as proof that the campaign demanded adaptation, not complaint. Roots and tubers unfamiliar to Greeks entered the diet. These were boiled repeatedly to remove bitterness or toxicity. Knowledge came from local guides, often under pressure. Alexander insisted on caution. He tasted small amounts first, waited, observed, and only then allowed wider use. This careful process prevented panic and illness. It also reinforced trust. If the king survived the meal, others followed. Fatigue altered digestion. Men who once tolerated heavy food now struggled with it. Alexander adjusted again, encouraging lighter meals when possible. Smaller portions eaten more often replaced large single meals. This approach stabilized energy and reduced sickness. It reflected an understanding that the army's condition had changed permanently. In jungle and river regions, fish and river creatures became important. Fresh fish required little preservation and could be cooked quickly. Alexander accepted these foods readily. Fish stews, lightly salted and boiled, became common. They lacked richness but sustained strength. This adaptation allowed continued movement without reliance on distant supply lines. Salt remained a constant concern. It preserved food, replaced minerals, and improved morale. When salt ran low, meals became harder to endure. Alexander ensured distribution remained fair. No one received more because of rank. This equality prevented resentment during already fragile periods. Alcohol consumption was reduced further. Wine, when available, was diluted heavily or avoided entirely during demanding marches. Alexander believed clarity of mind outweighed temporary comfort. He drank sparingly, especially when the army's morale wavered. Intoxication during exhaustion led to mistakes, and mistakes cost lives. Illness spread more easily as exhaustion accumulated. Fevers, stomach problems, and infections weakened even seasoned veterans. Alexander's own health suffered. During these periods, his diet shifted toward survival rather than strength. Thin broths, warm liquids, and softened grain dominated. These foods were easier to digest and conserved energy. Food distribution during sickness became critical. Alexander ensured the weakest were prioritized, not the highest ranking. This decision reinforced loyalty during moments when the army questioned whether continuing was possible at all. Fairness in food became fairness in fate. As resistance grew among troops weary of endless marching, food became a tool for negotiation within the army itself. Improved rations after particularly harsh stretches helped stabilize morale. Alexander timed these improvements carefully. He avoided sudden abundance, which could lead to illness or loss of discipline. Gradual improvement maintained balance. In regions of sudden plenty, Alexander resisted extended feasting. He allowed brief relief, then returned to restraint. He feared stagnation more than hunger. Comfort threatened momentum, and momentum was all that held the campaign together. Food also became symbolic during councils and meetings. Alexander ate simply even when officers were offered more. This visible restraint communicated resolve. It reminded others that the campaign demanded sacrifice at every level. As years passed, Alexander's eating habits reflected the reality of a man carrying both physical and psychological weight. Meals were quiet. Conversation faded. Food became preparation for endurance rather than pleasure. This shift marked a commander nearing the limits of what a human body could sustain. Despite this, Alexander remained adaptable. He never insisted on a single cultural diet. He accepted whatever nourished without weakening. This flexibility allowed survival in environments that would have broken a more rigid leader. By now, food had become routine, stripped of meaning beyond function. Eat to move. Eat to endure. Eat to hold the army together one more day. Alexander embraced this simplicity fully, understanding that conquest had long since given way to survival. And so the campaign continued, shaped quietly by what could be eaten, what had to be refused, and what had to be shared. Food no longer symbolized victory. It symbolized continuation. As long as men could eat, however simply, the march could continue. As the campaign entered its final stretch, food was no longer a question of expansion or adaptation. It became a question of limits. Alexander had pushed farther than any Macedonian leader before him, and the distance itself now shaped every meal. Supplies took longer to reach the army. Local resources were unpredictable. Bodies that had endured years of strain responded more slowly to nourishment. In this phase, Alexander's diet reflected a commander managing decline as carefully as he once managed growth. Meals were now planned with recovery in mind rather than momentum. Alexander understood that exhaustion did not announce itself suddenly. It crept in through slower reactions, weaker grip, longer recovery after wounds. Food could not restore what years had taken, but it could slow the loss. Portions were steady, never generous. Consistency mattered more than quantity. Grain remained central, but preparation shifted again. Coarse bread was often soaked in water or broth before eating. This made it easier to digest and reduced strain on the body. Alexander accepted these softened foods without complaint. Eating became slower, quieter, more deliberate. There was no rush to finish. Energy had to be conserved even while consuming it. Broths took on increased importance. Bone broths, vegetable broths, lightly salted and warm, were consumed regularly. These liquids carried nutrients without burdening digestion. Ancient medicine valued such preparations for restoring balance in weakened bodies. Alexander followed this practice closely, especially during periods of fever or after injuries. Meat appeared less frequently now, not because it was unwanted, but because it was harder to manage. Livestock losses were severe after years of movement. When meat did appear, it was distributed carefully. Lean portions were avoided when possible. Fat was valued. Alexander ensured this distribution remained fair and visible, reinforcing trust during a time when morale was fragile. Rice and similar grains continued to dominate where available. Their ease of preparation and digestion made them ideal for weakened soldiers. Alexander embraced these foods fully, no longer treating them as adaptations, but as necessities. Tradition no longer mattered. Survival did. Fruit, once a morale tool, became rare again. When available, it was shared in small amounts. Alexander avoided sudden indulgence even in sweetness. Too much after deprivation caused illness and disappointment. Balance was everything now. Water management remained critical. In some regions, water scarcity forced further reductions in food intake. Alexander followed these restrictions personally. He believed thirst was more dangerous than hunger, and digestion demanded water the body could not spare. His discipline reinforced calm during moments when panic could have shattered the army. Alcohol consumption was minimal to non-existent during this stage. Wine, once a social and caloric resource, was now seen as unnecessary risk. Alexander avoided it almost entirely during demanding periods. Clarity of mind was the last resource he could not afford to lose. Illness became a constant presence. Fevers weakened men unpredictably. Alexander himself suffered recurring sickness. During these periods, his diet narrowed further. Thin broths, warm water, softened grain. No excess. No experimentation. Stability mattered more than nutrition variety. Food also became a language of reassurance. When Alexander ate publicly, even small portions, it calmed fear. Soldiers watched his plate closely. If he endured, they endured. If he refused privilege, resentment faded. Eating remained one of the few direct ways he could communicate leadership without words. As resistance within the army grew toward the end of the campaign, food played a role in negotiation. Alexander allowed controlled improvements when needed, not as reward, but as reassurance. He understood that starvation broke loyalty faster than defeat. Yet he avoided overcompensation, which could trigger sickness or discipline loss. In councils, Alexander continued to eat simply, even when officers were offered more. This restraint maintained authority during debates over whether to continue or return. Food equality supported unity when words alone could not. At this point, Alexander's eating habits were no longer about conquering land. They were about managing human limits. He had learned that armies did not fail only in battle. They failed when bodies could no longer recover from effort. Food became the quiet defense against collapse. Despite exhaustion, Alexander remained adaptable. He never clung to a single diet or tradition. Whatever sustained life without weakening resolve was accepted. This flexibility allowed survival long after ambition had outpaced capacity. Meals were now brief, functional, and stripped of ceremony. Conversation focused on logistics, weather, and movement. Food prepared the body for one more march, one more decision. Pleasure had no place here. Through this final phase, Alexander's diet reflected the truth of the campaign. Conquest had turned into endurance. Expansion had turned into maintenance. Food no longer symbolized victory. It symbolized continuation, fragile and uncertain. And as the army pressed onward under this strain, what Alexander ate became less important than how he ate. Simply, publicly, without privilege. These habits held the army together when momentum alone could not. By now, the campaign had reached a stage where food was no longer expected to strengthen the army. Its purpose was simpler and more fragile. Food now existed to prevent complete breakdown. Alexander understood this clearly. The body could no longer be pushed forward by ambition alone. It needed careful maintenance, and every meal became part of that maintenance. Rations were now planned with extreme caution. Grain stores were counted repeatedly. Losses through rot, insects, or poor storage were taken seriously. Alexander knew that even small miscalculations could force retreat or spark unrest. He supported strict discipline around food storage and preparation, not as punishment but as survival practice. He followed these rules himself, never accepting exceptions. Meals were quieter than ever. There was little conversation during eating. Men focused on conserving energy. Alexander ate in the same silence. Food was consumed slowly, deliberately. Chewing thoroughly reduced strain on weakened digestion. This attention to small details reflected how fragile endurance had become. Broths continued to dominate the diet. Bone broths carried salt, fat, and warmth. Vegetable broth stretched limited supplies and provided hydration. Alexander consumed these regularly, especially during periods of illness. Ancient medical thought viewed warm liquids as stabilizing, and Alexander trusted this tradition. Bread, once eaten dry or coarse, was now softened almost routinely. Hard bread could injure teeth already worn down by years of rough food. Soaking bread in water or broth became common. This small adaptation preserved strength and reduced pain. Alexander accepted this without hesitation. Comfort was allowed only when it preserved function. Meat was rare and carefully managed. When animals were slaughtered, every part was used. Organs were consumed quickly to prevent spoilage. Fat was shared deliberately. Alexander ensured no single group received more than another. Equality in food mattered more now than at any earlier stage. Unequal distribution would have shattered what little morale remained. In river regions, fish continued to supplement the diet. Simple boiled fish required little fuel and provided protein without storage problems. Alexander ate these meals regularly when available. Fish was not celebrated. It was used. Fruit, once symbolic of relief, was now treated cautiously. Bodies weakened by long deprivation reacted poorly to sudden sweetness. Small portions were distributed carefully. Alexander avoided indulgence even when fruit was plentiful. Balance mattered more than morale boosts at this stage. Water remained the most precious resource. In extreme conditions, Alexander reduced food intake deliberately to conserve water. Digestion demanded moisture the body could not spare. He explained this logic to officers, reinforcing discipline through understanding rather than command. Alcohol was largely absent now. Wine, once a tool for bonding, had no place during exhaustion. Alexander avoided it almost entirely. Clarity of judgment was his last advantage. He protected it fiercely. Illness and injury shaped eating habits constantly. Fevers reduced appetite. Wounds slowed recovery. Alexander's own health declined. During sickness, his diet narrowed to the simplest forms possible. Warm liquids, softened grain, nothing more. Ancient physicians emphasized avoiding excess during illness, and Alexander followed this guidance carefully. Food also became a signal of intent. When Alexander ate publicly, it reassured the army that leadership remained steady. If he endured hunger, they endured it with him. This shared deprivation preserved unity during moments when rebellion or collapse seemed possible. As resistance among troops increased near the end of the campaign, food played a role in negotiation. Alexander allowed slight improvements in rations to stabilize morale, but he avoided dramatic changes. Sudden abundance could cause illness and false hope. Gradual adjustment preserved control. Officers watched Alexander closely. He continued to eat modestly even when others argued for rest or retreat. His restraint communicated resolve more clearly than words. Food remained one of the few visible measures of leadership left to him. By this stage, Alexander's diet was no longer influenced by culture, conquest, or curiosity. It was shaped entirely by necessity. Whatever preserved life without weakening resolve was accepted. Everything else was rejected. Meals were brief, functional, and emotionally flat. There was no celebration, no anticipation. Eating prepared the body for one more day of endurance. That was all it needed to do. Food had become rhythm rather than reward. Eat to survive. Eat to move. Eat to hold the army together one more day. Alexander accepted this rhythm fully, even as his body struggled to keep pace. And so the campaign continued under this fragile balance, shaped quietly by what could still be eaten, what had to be avoided, and what had to be shared equally. Food no longer promised victory. It promised only continuation. As the long campaign approached its final phase, food became less about choice and more about inevitability. Alexander was now leading an army that had reached the edge of what the ancient world could support. Distance had stretched supply lines beyond reliability. Seasons had passed without rest. Bodies carried years of strain. In this reality, what Alexander ate reflected not ambition, but acceptance of human limits. Rations were now governed by conservation rather than planning. Grain was no longer stored for comfort, but guarded against disaster. Every sack mattered. Alexander ordered repeated inspections, not because he mistrusted his officers, but because error could no longer be absorbed. He ate according to these same restrictions, never requesting additional portions, even when illness or exhaustion might have justified it. Meals were increasingly uniform. Grain boiled into thin porridge appeared again and again. Variety disappeared almost completely. This monotony was not accidental. Predictable food reduced digestive stress and prevented illness caused by sudden change. Alexander accepted the boredom of eating the same meal repeatedly, understanding that novelty now carried risk. Cooking became even more minimal. Fires were small, brief, and often shared between many men. One pot served many mouths. Broths were stretched thin to feed more people. Vegetables, when available, were added to increase volume rather than flavor. Alexander ate these same thin meals, often without pause, sometimes while listening to reports or issuing quiet instructions. Meat had become rare enough to be noteworthy. When it appeared, it was distributed carefully, prioritizing the weakest and most injured. Alexander did not place himself above this system. If meat was limited, he accepted smaller portions or none at all. This restraint preserved trust during a time when morale was fragile. Fat remained essential. When animals were slaughtered, fat was rendered and shared. It provided calories that grain alone could not. Alexander understood this value and ensured fair distribution. Food equity mattered now more than ever. Any perception of privilege could trigger resentment that the army could no longer afford. Rice and similar grains continued to support the army where available. Their ease of digestion and efficient preparation made them ideal for weakened bodies. Alexander relied on these foods without hesitation. Cultural attachment to Macedonian grain no longer mattered. Survival dictated preference. Water scarcity continued to shape every meal. In some regions, food intake was reduced deliberately to conserve water. Alexander followed these reductions himself. He believed thirst was more dangerous than hunger, and refused to undermine discipline by seeking exceptions. Alcohol was almost entirely absent now. Wine, once a source of calories and morale, had become unnecessary risk. Alexander avoided it during this phase. Clear judgment mattered more than comfort, especially as decisions grew heavier and options narrower. Illness spread more easily among exhausted troops. Fevers lingered. Wounds healed slowly. Alexander's own health continued to decline. During these periods, his diet narrowed further. Thin broths, warm water, softened grain. Nothing else. Ancient medical thought emphasized restraint during sickness, and Alexander followed this practice strictly. Food also became a stabilizing ritual. Even when portions were small, the act of eating together preserved a sense of order. Alexander ate publicly when possible, reinforcing the idea that leadership remained present and accountable. Silence during meals became normal. Eating was functional, not social. As pressure grew within the army to end the campaign, food became part of the unspoken debate. Soldiers watched how Alexander endured hunger and restraint. His willingness to share deprivation strengthened his authority even when words failed to convince. In moments of slight abundance, Alexander resisted the temptation to indulge. He allowed gradual improvements, not sudden feasts. Sudden richness caused illness and false optimism. Balance preserved control. By now, Alexander's eating habits were defined entirely by endurance. There was no pleasure, no experimentation, no symbolism beyond survival. Food had become a tool to delay collapse. Nothing more. Meals were short. Movement followed quickly. There was no lingering. Energy had to be conserved for marching, planning, and maintaining cohesion. Alexander adapted fully to this rhythm, even as his body struggled under accumulated strain. Food, once a symbol of shared hardship and leadership, had now become a fragile thread holding the army together. As long as men could eat, even minimally, the campaign could continue. When food failed, everything else would fail with it. Alexander understood this truth deeply. What he ate was no longer about who he was as a king, but about whether the army could survive one more day. And so he ate simply, publicly, and without privilege, maintaining the delicate balance that allowed the campaign to continue at all. By this point, food had become something Alexander no longer thought about consciously. It was no longer planned with optimism or curiosity. It was managed with caution and restraint, like everything else in the final years of the campaign. Eating had become part of survival machinery, not a moment of relief. Alexander understood that the body could no longer be rebuilt. It could only be preserved long enough to keep moving. Rations were now issued with almost ritual precision. Grain amounts rarely changed. This consistency reduced anxiety. Soldiers learned exactly what to expect, and expectation itself became a form of stability. Alexander accepted these portions without question. He never asked for more, even on days of extreme fatigue. Ancient sources note that his refusal of special treatment became more pronounced the longer the campaign lasted. Meals were eaten slowly now. not for pleasure, but because weakened bodies demanded it. Eating too quickly caused discomfort and illness. Bread, often soaked in water or broth, was chewed carefully. Alexander followed the same pace. There was no urgency. Energy had to be conserved even during nourishment. Broths continued to dominate daily intake. Thin, warm, lightly salted liquids helped maintain hydration and digestion. Bone broths, vegetable broths, grain broths, everything was reduced to its most basic, absorbable form. Alexander consumed these regularly, especially during periods of illness or fever. Ancient medicine emphasized warmth and moderation, and Alexander trusted these principles completely. Meat had become so rare that it was no longer expected. When it appeared, it was treated as a medical resource rather than a reward. Portions were directed toward the injured and severely weakened. Alexander never placed himself first. His restraint reinforced trust during a time when morale rested on fairness more than hope. Fat remained essential. Rendered fat was sometimes mixed into grain to increase calories without increasing volume. This small addition made a significant difference during exhaustion. Alexander understood its value and ensured equal distribution. Fruit was handled carefully. Sudden sweetness after long deprivation could cause illness. When fruit was available, it was shared in small, controlled portions. Alexander avoided indulgence completely, even when his own body showed signs of weakness. Stability mattered more than comfort. Water scarcity continued to dictate eating patterns. In dry regions, Alexander reduced food intake deliberately to preserve hydration. Digestion required water the body could not spare. He explained this logic to officers, reinforcing discipline through understanding rather than command. Alcohol had almost vanished from the diet entirely. Wine was no longer a source of morale or calories. It was seen as risk. Alexander avoided it, especially as decision-making grew more fragile. Clear judgment was his final defense against collapse. Illness remained constant. Fevers returned without warning. Wounds reopened. Alexander's own health suffered noticeably. During sickness, his diet narrowed to the simplest possible forms: warm liquids, soft grain, nothing else. He followed medical advice strictly, understanding that excess would prolong weakness. Food also became a visible sign of resolve. Soldiers watched Alexander's plate closely. If he endured hunger calmly, panic subsided. If he refused privilege, resentment faded. Eating became one of the last ways Alexander could communicate leadership without words. As pressure grew within the army to return home, food distribution took on political meaning. Alexander ensured fairness more strictly than ever. Any sign of inequality could trigger rebellion. Food discipline preserved cohesion when ambition no longer united the men. Meals were now almost silent. Conversation faded. Eating was functional, brief, and emotionally flat. This was not despair. It was adaptation. The army had adjusted to survival mode, and Alexander led by example. At this stage, Alexander's diet reflected the truth of the campaign. Conquest had ended long ago. What remained was endurance under strain. Food was no longer fuel for ambition. It was maintenance for survival. Each meal prepared the body for one more march, one more decision, one more day. Nothing more was expected of it. Alexander accepted this fully, even as his strength diminished. And so the campaign continued under this fragile balance. held together by discipline, restraint, and the simplest possible nourishment. Food no longer promised success. It promised only continuation, day by day, until continuation itself became impossible. Now the campaign exists in a narrow space between motion and exhaustion. Alexander no longer measures days by distance conquered, but by whether the army can still function tomorrow. Food at this stage becomes almost invisible in its simplicity. It is no longer discussed, praised, or complained about. It simply appears, is consumed, and disappears, leaving behind either enough strength to continue or clear signs that the limits are near. The structure of meals has flattened completely. There is no sense of occasion. Grain, water, and whatever minimal additions are available arrive in the same pattern day after day. Alexander accepts this without resistance. He no longer expects variation, and neither do his men. Expectation itself has been trained out of them. This lack of anticipation reduces disappointment and keeps emotions level. Grain porridge dominates nearly every meal. Thin, warm, lightly salted, and filling just enough to quiet hunger without exhausting digestion. Alexander eats it slowly, deliberately, often in silence. This food is not meant to energize aggressively. It is meant to preserve what little strength remains. Ancient understanding recognized that weakened bodies required gentleness, not abundance. Bread, when available, is almost always softened. Teeth worn down by years of coarse food make hard bread painful. Soaking bread in water or broth becomes routine. Alexander adopts this without hesitation. Adaptation is no longer optional. Comfort is allowed only where it preserves function. Broths remain central. Bone broths carry minerals and fat. Vegetable broths stretch limited supplies. Grain broths combine hydration with nourishment. Alexander consumes these regularly, especially during periods when fever or weakness returns. Warmth becomes as important as calories. Cold food drains energy the body can no longer spare. Meat has almost vanished from daily life. When it appears, it is treated as medicine. Portions go first to the injured, the sick, and the most depleted. Alexander never argues against this distribution. He understands that leadership now means restraint beyond reason. His authority rests on fairness more than command. Fat remains critical. Rendered fat, mixed into grain or broth, provides dense energy without volume. This small addition often determines whether a man can continue marching. Alexander ensures this fat is shared evenly. Any sign of favoritism would fracture trust instantly. Fruit is rare and carefully controlled. Bodies weakened by long deprivation react poorly to sudden sweetness. When fruit appears, it is distributed in small amounts, often mixed into meals rather than eaten alone. Alexander avoids indulgence entirely. Stability matters more than momentary comfort. Water continues to dictate eating behavior. In regions where water is scarce, food intake is reduced intentionally. Digestion consumes moisture the body cannot replace. Alexander follows these restrictions personally, reinforcing discipline through example. His refusal to drink or eat more than others steadies panic during desperate moments. Alcohol is absent now. Wine has no place in a body struggling to recover from constant strain. Alexander avoids it completely. Clear judgment, even when exhausted, is the last remaining advantage he possesses. Illness remains unpredictable. Fevers come and go, infections linger. Alexander's own health deteriorates visibly. During sickness, his diet narrows further. Warm water, thin broth, softened grain, nothing else. Ancient medicine emphasized restraint during illness, and Alexander follows this principle rigidly. Food distribution becomes one of the final tools holding the army together. Soldiers watch closely. If Alexander eats, they eat. If he endures hunger calmly, they follow. Food becomes a language of shared fate. No speeches are needed. Meals are now brief and quiet. There is little conversation. Eating is preparation, not pause. The army has adapted to a state where survival requires emotional neutrality. Alexander leads this neutrality by example. At this stage, food no longer reflects culture, conquest, or curiosity. It reflects the truth of human limitation. The body cannot be pushed endlessly, no matter how great the ambition. Nourishment now exists only to delay collapse, not to prevent it. Alexander understands this fully. He eats not to grow stronger, but to remain functional. Each meal buys one more day. That is all it can do. And so the march continues, sustained by the simplest possible nourishment, governed by discipline rather than desire. Food, stripped of meaning, still holds the army together, quietly determining how long Alexander and his men can continue to exist as a moving force in a world that has already taken almost everything from them. At this stage, food is no longer experienced as hunger followed by relief. It has become a background condition of life, steady and unremarkable, yet absolutely essential. Alexander moves through his days with the understanding that the army's strength now depends on avoiding extremes. Too little food invites collapse. Too much invites illness. Balance, narrow and fragile, is all that remains. Meals arrive quietly. There is no anticipation, no discussion. Men take their portions and eat without ceremony. Alexander does the same. He no longer sits apart, nor does he draw attention to himself. His presence is calm, almost neutral. This calmness matters. Anxiety spreads faster than hunger, and food discipline is as much emotional as physical. Grain remains the foundation, but its preparation continues to evolve. Porridge is thinner now, easier to digest, less demanding on bodies worn down by years of strain. Salt is measured carefully, enough to replace what is lost through sweat, never enough to encourage thirst. Alexander accepts these adjustments naturally. Adaptation has become instinct. Broths remain constant. Warm liquid, steady nourishment, minimal effort to consume. Bone broths are reused again and again, stretched across days. Vegetable scraps are added whenever possible. Nothing is wasted. Alexander understands that waste at this stage is not careless, it is dangerous. Every discarded resource is one less day of endurance. Bread, when present, is rarely eaten dry. Soaking has become standard. This protects weakened teeth and reduces strain on digestion. Alexander eats slowly, deliberately, conserving energy even in the act of nourishment. Eating itself has become labor that must be managed carefully. Meat is almost absent. When it appears, it is treated with caution. Small portions carefully distributed. No celebration, no sense of reward. Meat now serves the body, not morale. Alexander does not request it, even when his own strength fades. Leadership now demands restraint that borders on self-denial. Fat remains critical. A small amount mixed into grain or broth can determine whether a man collapses or continues. Alexander ensures equal distribution, understanding that perceived unfairness would undo everything the army has endured. Food equity is now more important than rank. Fruit appears rarely and unpredictably. When it does, it is handled with care. Sudden sweetness can shock weakened bodies. Portions are small, sometimes mixed into meals rather than eaten alone. Alexander avoids indulgence completely. Comfort is only allowed when it preserves stability. Water scarcity continues to dominate decisions. Food intake is reduced deliberately in dry regions. Alexander follows these restrictions without exception. He understands that digestion consumes water, and water is life. His discipline steadies the army when fear rises. Alcohol is gone entirely from daily life. Wine, once a source of calories and bonding, has no place here. Alexander avoids it completely. Clear thought is the last remaining resource he can protect. Illness continues to move through the army unpredictably. Fevers weaken men suddenly. Recovery is slow. Alexander's own health deteriorates further. During sickness, his diet narrows to its simplest form. Warm liquids, soft grain, nothing else. Ancient medical practice emphasized restraint, and Alexander adheres to it strictly. Food distribution has now become one of the final visible expressions of leadership. Soldiers watch closely. If Alexander eats calmly, they remain calm. If he accepts hunger without complaint, resentment dissolves. Food communicates shared fate more clearly than words ever could. Meals are short and quiet. There is no laughter, no storytelling. Eating prepares the body to move, nothing more. This emotional neutrality is not despair. It is adaptation. The army has learned to survive without expectation. At this point, Alexander's diet reflects a truth he fully understands. The body cannot be pushed indefinitely. Nourishment can delay collapse, but it cannot reverse years of strain. Food is now maintenance, not recovery. Each meal buys a little time. One more march, one more decision, one more night without breaking apart. Alexander accepts this reality without illusion. He eats not to conquer, not to celebrate, but to endure. And so the army continues, held together by routine, restraint, and the simplest nourishment possible. Food has lost its identity as culture or comfort. It has become a quiet, steady force determining how long Alexander and his men can continue to exist as a single moving body in a world that has already taken nearly everything. By now, the act of eating has become almost mechanical, stripped of emotion and expectation. Alexander lives within a narrow rhythm where food appears not as relief, but as requirement. There is no longer any question of preference. What matters is absorption, tolerance, and continuation. The body no longer asks for more. It only asks not to fail. Meals are timed carefully, not by hunger, but by fatigue. Eating too early drains energy. Eating too late disrupts rest. Alexander follows this rhythm instinctively now. Years of campaigning have taught him when the body can accept nourishment and when it must be left undisturbed. This timing becomes as important as the food itself. Grain porridge remains dominant, but now even its texture is adjusted. When bodies weaken further, the porridge becomes thinner, closer to liquid than solid. This reduces strain on digestion and preserves energy. Alexander eats slowly, pausing between Eating itself has become an exercise in restraint. Broths continue to anchor the diet. Bone broth is reused repeatedly, enriched only when something new becomes available. Vegetable skins, roots, and scraps are added carefully. Salt is measured precisely. Too much increases thirst. Too little weakens the body. Alexander understands this balance deeply and never interferes with it for comfort. Bread appears less often now. When it does, it is treated gently. Always soaked, always softened. Teeth worn down by years of hard food make dry bread painful and inefficient. Alexander accepts this adaptation fully. Pride has no place here. Function overrides identity. Meat has nearly vanished entirely. When animals are slaughtered, it is often for necessity rather than diet. Sick animals are avoided. Portions are small. Fat is valued more than flesh. Alexander ensures distribution remains equal and visible. At this stage, fairness is not symbolic. It is structural. Without it, the army collapses inward. Fat continues to serve as the quiet difference between endurance and failure. Rendered fat, mixed into grain or broth, provides dense energy that weakened bodies can still process. Alexander watches its distribution closely, understanding that even small inequalities can spark resentment when patience is exhausted. Fruit is almost non-existent now. When it appears, it is treated cautiously, sometimes diluted in water or mixed into meals. Sudden sweetness can shock depleted systems. Alexander avoids it entirely unless advised otherwise. Stability outweighs pleasure. Water scarcity dominates every decision. In some regions, water is rationed more strictly than food. Alexander reduces intake deliberately, knowing digestion demands water the body cannot spare. His discipline reinforces calm when desperation threatens order. Alcohol is completely absent. Wine has no place in this phase. Alexander avoids it without exception. Clear thought is the last resource he protects. Even mild intoxication would be dangerous now. Illness becomes more frequent and less predictable. Fevers linger longer. Recovery slows. Alexander's own condition deteriorates visibly. During sickness, his diet contracts further. Warm water, thin broth, soft grain, nothing else. Ancient medical practice emphasized restraint during illness, and Alexander follows it strictly, trusting experience over desire. Food distribution now carries enormous emotional weight. Soldiers no longer listen for speeches. They watch plates. If Alexander eats, they eat. If he endures hunger calmly, panic fades. Food has become leadership's final visible language. Meals are nearly silent. Eating is brief. Conversation is minimal. Nourishment prepares the body for movement, not reflection. Emotional neutrality has become survival skill. Alexander embodies this neutrality, steady even as strength fades. At this point, food has lost all cultural meaning. Macedonian traditions, Persian luxuries, Eastern adaptations, all have dissolved into function. What remains is nourishment reduced to its simplest form. Eat to exist. Eat to delay collapse. Alexander understands now that no amount of discipline can reverse time. Food can only slow decline. Each meal buys another day of cohesion, another decision made with clarity rather than desperation. And so the army moves forward, sustained by routine, fairness, and restraint. Food no longer inspires. It stabilizes. It holds together bodies and will just long enough for the march to continue, even as the margin for survival grows thinner with every passing day. At this stage, food exists almost outside of time. Days blur together and meals no longer divide them clearly. Alexander moves through a routine shaped by exhaustion rather than ambition, where nourishment is measured not in satisfaction, but in whether the body can still respond when commanded to move. Eating has become an act of preservation, quiet and disciplined, stripped of all excess. The army's relationship with food is now defined by trust. Trust that rations will arrive. Trust that distribution will remain fair. Trust that no one, not even the king, is quietly taking more. Alexander protects this trust carefully. He eats where he can be seen, not to perform humility but to prevent suspicion. In these conditions, suspicion spreads faster than hunger. Meals remain small and carefully timed. Eating too much overwhelms weakened systems. Eating too little invites collapse. Alexander follows the same narrow margin as his men. Grain porridge is thinner now than ever, closer to warm liquid than solid food. It provides energy without burden. Alexander consumes it slowly, letting warmth settle before taking more. Broths remain the backbone of survival. Bone broths are stretched across days, reused, enriched only when scraps appear. Vegetable peelings, roots, and stems are added carefully. Salt is rationed precisely. Alexander never interferes with these preparations for comfort. He understands that discipline in small things keeps larger systems intact. Bread has nearly disappeared. When it does appear, it is always softened. Dry bread costs too much energy to digest and causes pain to worn teeth. Alexander adapts without hesitation. Identity tied to food has long vanished. What matters is tolerance. Meat is almost entirely absent. When an animal is slaughtered, it is often due to necessity rather than choice. Portions are small. Fat is rendered and shared carefully. Alexander watches this process closely. At this point, fairness is not symbolic leadership. It is structural survival. Fat continues to determine endurance. A small amount mixed into grain or broth provides dense energy that exhausted bodies can still use. Alexander ensures equal distribution, knowing that inequality would fracture the fragile cohesion holding the army together. Fruit appears rarely and unpredictably. When it does, it is handled with extreme caution. Sudden sweetness shocks weakened bodies. Portions are minimal, sometimes diluted or mixed into meals. Alexander avoids it entirely unless advised otherwise. Comfort has no value if it destabilizes. Water scarcity remains the constant threat beneath every decision. Food intake is reduced deliberately when water is limited. Alexander follows these reductions personally. Digestion demands water the body cannot spare. His restraint steadies fear when desperation presses close. Alcohol is gone completely. Wine no longer exists as nourishment, morale, or ritual. Alexander avoids it without exception. Clear judgment is the final resource he protects, even as fatigue dulls everything else. Illness moves unpredictably through the army. Fevers weaken men without warning. Recovery is slow. Alexander's own health continues to decline. During sickness, his diet contracts further. Warm water, thin broth, soft grain, nothing more. Ancient medical understanding emphasized restraint during illness, and Alexander adheres to it rigidly. Food distribution has now become the final visible expression of leadership. Soldiers no longer listen closely to commands. They watch plates. If Alexander eats calmly, fear recedes. If he accepts hunger without complaint, resentment dissolves. Food communicates shared fate more clearly than words. Meals are silent and brief. Eating prepares the body to stand, walk, and obey. There is no reflection, no anticipation. Emotional neutrality has become a survival skill. Alexander embodies this neutrality, steady even as strength fades. At this point, food has lost every cultural meaning it once held. Macedonian bread, Persian feasts, Eastern grains, all have dissolved into function. What remains is nourishment reduced to its bare purpose. Eat to exist. Eat to delay collapse. Alexander understands fully now that nourishment cannot restore what years have taken. It can only slow decline. Each meal buys time. One more march. One more decision made without panic. One more day of cohesion. And so the army continues, not driven by glory but sustained by routine, fairness, and restraint. Food no longer inspires. It stabilizes. It holds together bodies and will just long enough for movement to continue, even as the margin between endurance and failure grows thinner with every passing step. At the very end of the long road, food is no longer something Alexander measures against strength, ambition, or conquest. It becomes something quieter, something final. The army still eats, because bodies must, but everyone understands that nourishment can no longer change the course already set in motion. It can only soften the edges of what is coming. Alexander's meals near the end are the simplest of his life. Warm liquids dominate almost entirely. Thin broths, lightly salted water, softened grain taken slowly. These are not choices. They are necessities dictated by a body that has been pushed beyond what ancient medicine ever imagined possible. Heavy food is no longer tolerated. Rich food is unthinkable. Even moderate portions are taken carefully with long pauses in between. Grain porridge is now almost translucent, more warmth than substance. It quiets hunger without demanding effort from digestion. Alexander eats it slowly, sometimes stopping before finishing. There is no frustration in this, only acceptance. The body has limits, and he has reached them. Bread has all but vanished. When it appears, it is soaked completely, barely holding its shape. Teeth worn down by years of marching and coarse food can no longer manage hardness. Alexander adapts without resistance. Pride has long since dissolved. Only function remains. Meat is no longer part of daily life at all. When animals are slaughtered, it is for the sake of the army, not the king. Fat is rendered and shared. Broths are strengthened where possible. Alexander never places himself above this system. Even at the end, equality in food remains essential. Leadership without fairness would mean nothing now. Fruit, once a rare comfort, is avoided entirely. Sweetness shocks weakened bodies. Stability matters more than relief. Alexander understands this instinctively. What once lifted morale now threatens imbalance. Water remains the most important element of survival. Food intake adjusts around it. Alexander continues to restrict himself when water is scarce, understanding that digestion consumes moisture the body can no longer spare. His discipline remains unchanged, even as strength fades. Alcohol is completely absent. Wine has no role left to play. Alexander avoids it entirely. Clarity of mind, even when the body fails. is the final form of control he maintains. Illness becomes constant, fevers linger, weakness deepens. During these periods, Alexander's intake narrows further. Warm water, thin broth, soft grain, nothing more. Ancient physicians advise restraint, and Alexander follows their guidance fully, trusting experience over desire. Food distribution continues even as the campaign slows and fragments. Soldiers still watch closely. If Alexander eats, they eat. If he accepts hunger calmly, panic remains contained. Even now, food remains language. It communicates steadiness when words no longer can. Meals are silent. There is no conversation, no reflection. Eating prepares the body for rest rather than movement. The army has shifted from endurance to waiting. Nourishment no longer fuels marching. It simply preserves life from one day to the next. By the end, Alexander's diet tells the true story of his campaign more clearly than any battle account. He began with bread, olives, and shared meals as a young king, proving himself. He passed through abundance, curiosity, and adaptation as he conquered empires. And he ends with warm liquids and restraint, leading men through decline with the same discipline he once used to lead them through victory. Food never made Alexander great, but how he ate reveals how he ruled. He shared hardship. He refused privilege. He adapted without complaint. He understood that leadership was not proven by feasting when supplies were full, but by restraint when everything was running out. In the end, Alexander eats not to conquer, not to inspire, but simply to exist a little longer alongside the men who followed him farther than any army had ever gone before. Nourishment becomes quiet, almost invisible, yet it remains the thread that holds what is left together. And so this history closes where it began. Not with gold tables or royal feasts, but with simple food taken carefully, publicly, and without excess. Bread softened by water, broth warmed by fire. A leader who never separated his hunger from his army's hunger. As the long march fades into memory, what Alexander ate stands as a reminder that even the greatest figures in history were bound by the same needs as every other human being. They ate to endure. They ate to survive. And in the end, they ate to let history finish its course.